So why isn't the Jiki Jiki no Mi, otherwise known as the Magnet Fruit, not a Logia type Devil Fruit? As you know, it's described as a Paramecia type Devil Fruit, but the reason why this is weird is because, like all the other Logia type Devil Fruits in One Piece, magnetism is a natural force, both in the real world and the world of One Piece, because magnetism is literally how people go from island to island via the use of the various forms of the log poses, because a log pose is locked on an island's unique magnetic field, and then it wears off and it locks on to the next island's unique magnetic field. So with that being said, magnetism is an essential force for traveling in the One Piece world, especially in the Grand Line. So with that being said, it's very strange that the magnet fruit is not a Logia type Devil Fruit. What's also quite weird about this is that when you look at all the Logia type Devil Fruits in the series, all of them have a very consistent design about them, as they all look like artistic representations of the element that they give. The magnet fruit is no different, as it literally looks like a bunch of steel balls with lightning motifs attached to them, bound up by a coil that also has a lightning bolt motif. Magnetism is just the motion of electric charges. So in the way that it's being represented here, that makes sense, and it puts it apart from the rumble fruit, which is the actual electricity generating fruit. So with that being said, I could see why the Jiki no Mi, the magnet fruit, could be a Logia type Devil Fruit. Another interesting thing about this is that, and this is a small point, but it's an interesting point, the Logia class has not gotten a subtype yet. The Zoan class has a bunch of subtypes. The Paramecia fruit class has at least one subtype in Special Paramecias. I did a video on whom I think a Special Paramecia is in the series. But yeah, the Logia fruit class does not have a subtype. So perhaps Kid is a part of that subtype, because when looking at his entire power set, the weird thing about Kid is that he's not weird. His powers are very mundane and by the book compared to other Paramecia type powers that we've seen throughout the series. For example, Gecko Moria can touch a shadow and treat it like matter. Mind you, shadows don't really exist, and yet he can peel them away from a person, and then the lack of said shadow changes how that person is perceived by reality. Kid doesn't do anything like that. Nothing is exotic about his abilities. Even when you take into consideration his awakening abilities, like when he assigns magnetism to Big Mom. Well, Big Mom's a living person. People have iron in their bodies. So this could just be a further expression of his abilities. It doesn't necessarily even have to be an awakening. There's nothing that would really suggest that it is, which is really weird, but I could believe that he could mistake one thing for the other, looking at Luffy, for example. So even when you take into consideration the S that he puts on Big Mom and the N that he puts on the wall, we don't even know if those are actual representations of his ability, or if those are just there to illustrate what he is doing. It's very odd and deliberate in how he's shown off. And then to finish things off, what does he do? He makes a big gun and shoots electromagnetism out of said gun. That doesn't seem like an awakened ability to me. That's more or less what he's been doing the whole arc, making constructs and shooting off those constructs at the enemy. So it's super strange that he's being represented in this way if he's supposed to be an awakened Paramecia, while his powers are this mundane and straightforward. Now, when you're talking about Logias, Logias are pretty mundane and straightforward. The only unique one that we've ever had is Blackbeard. And then darkness is a pretty obscure concept, so that makes sense for him. But it's weird that Kid is displayed in this way, even taking into consideration the awakened ability? Well, when you consider other Logias, the body of the Logia does have unique properties that the generated material or force does not have. For example, Crocodile can dehydrate someone untouched. So perhaps the so-called awakening that he is doing, if it's deemed to be real, is just him bringing out magnetic material from a traditionally non-magnetic substance and therefore making it magnetic, supercharging those materials within that object and making it magnetic. Also, what's weird about this is that this has the same feel narratively as other special Logia abilities have had in the past, like Crocodile dehydrating things upon touch, or Blackbeard sucking in targets via the use of his hand using Black Vortex and then turning off the powers of a Devil Fruit user once they're in his grasp. So this just feels like one of those abilities. Perhaps it's just him further understanding what he can do as opposed to it being a special awakened ability. Perhaps he just thinks that it is because he's that slow in learning what his abilities can do. Or on the flip, because he's a particular different subtype of Logia, maybe his powers work a little more differently than other Logias do. And there's a bit of a learning curve to what is required of him. That could be too why he hasn't had the ability to turn into magnetism completely. Maybe he has to actively think about separating his body into magnetism, because much like Blackbeard, you could make the argument that because he is magnetism, his bonds are solid. So it's in his nature to stay together, to stay bounded up together, you know, kind of like the design of the actual fruit and how it's a bunch of steel balls bounded up by a coil of some sort. Pretty interesting. But to continue, instead of releasing said bonds in order for something to pass through him, maybe that's the idea that's being presented here. So that's why I'm thinking that his fruit could just be a subclass of the Logia fruit type. With that being said too, I know this comes off as a bit lame because I don't really like theories like this that piggyback off of the concept of this fruit is actually that fruit, like we got with Luffy. But in this case, the clues are there and it makes me wonder. So I think even moving forward, based on all the development that Paramecia has gotten over the years and now Zoan, I think it would be Logia's turn to develop further and get something different from what we've been seeing. Another smoking gun to him possibly being a Logia is that he has a prosthetic limb like Kuzan, which is very weird. And like Kuzan, the prosthetic limb only works because of his abilities. Kuzan has made a leg out of ice. Kid is using his powers all the time now to make his mechanical arm work. Because what's so strange about this is that Kid isn't really a mechanic, he's more of an artist. And that's been the whole bit about him for the longest. Law even mocks him about this because during the Big Mom fight, he's continuously making these huge sculptures. And Law says, we're going to make next an elephant, because his abilities are more so form over function. The only functional thing he ever makes is his big gun. So with that being said, it's quite likely if he is some sort of special Logia that he doesn't understand the full capabilities of his fruit because he doesn't have the scientific mind for it. Because based on what he can do, he does seem to have a very scientific ability, like akin to, say, Caesar Clown, in which you need to know what these particular things do that you're made of in order to use your power efficiently. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Works It!